The studio of conversations with Andrew Brown hummed with a restless energy as the cameras rolled, their lenses trained on the stark contrast of the night's players. Andrew Brown, the host with a razor-sharp tongue and a penchant for provocation, lounged in his chair, his eyes glinting with the promise of chaos. Across from him sat Elon Musk, the billionaire visionary whose presence alone shifted the room's gravity. The audience, a mix of skeptics and fans, buzzed with curiosity, sensing the potential for fireworks. They weren't wrong. This was no ordinary episode. Andrew kicked things off with his signature blend of charm and venom, steering the conversation toward the state of America. He prodded Elon to weigh in, his tone casual but loaded, inviting the guest to lay out his grand theories. Elon started strong, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd reshaped industries, but as he delved into the nation's fading edge in innovation and economic grit, something faltered. His words stumbled, hesitations creeping in, his hands fidgeting as he struggled to string his thoughts together. The audience noticed. Andrew noticed too, and his smirk widened. What was going on? Was Elon, the man who'd launched rockets and rewired the future, actually rattled? Andrew pounced, his questions sharpening as he circled the stutter like a shark scenting blood. He challenged Elon's take. How could someone so unsure of his own words claim to understand a country's soul? Was this the real Elon, stripped of his polished TED Talk veneer, or just a rare off-night? The crowd shifted, some leaning in, others whispering, as Andrew's probing grew more pointed. His tone laced with a mocking edge. Elon's eyes flicked, up meeting Andrew's gaze, but the unease lingered in his posture. He pushed forward, trying to salvage his point about America's need for bold reinvention, but the stumbles persisted. Brief pauses, half-formed sentences, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. Andrew didn't let it slide. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a taunting lilt as he questioned Elon's confidence, suggesting the tech titan wasn't the unshakable genius he portrayed. The audience murmured, caught between discomfort and fascination. Had Andrew found a crack in the myth? The host's jabs grew bolder, his skepticism morphing into something uglier. He painted Elon as a fraud coasting on hype, a man whose stuttering betrayed a deeper uncertainty, not just about America, but about his own legacy. Why should anyone trust a guy who couldn't even finish a sentence? Was this the same Elon, who'd stared down critics and built empires, or had the pressure finally caught up? The questions hung heavy, unanswered, as Elon's jaw tightened, his silence louder than any response. The segment barreled toward its first break, but the tension showed no sign of cooling. Andrew sat back, arms crossed, reveling in the unease. He'd sewn while Elon's hands stilled, his gaze hardening into something unreadable. The audience could feel it. A storm was brewing, and the next collision would be brutal. Had Andrew overplayed his hand, or was he about to expose Elon as a hollow icon? The cameras lingered, capturing every twitch, every shift, as the stage was set for a reckoning. The studio lights snapped back on after the break, casting a harsh glow over Andrew Brown's smug expression. He wasted no time diving back into the fray, his voice thick with mockery, as he zeroed in on Elon Musk's earlier stumbles. He framed the stuttering as a chink in the armor, a sign that the genius who'd conquered space and electric cars couldn't handle a simple conversation about his own country. The audience stirred, some chuckling nervously, others tensing as Andrew's tone grew more biting, his words laced with a glee that bordered on cruel. Elon sat across from him, his posture stiffening, his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on the armrest. He tried to steer the discussion back to substance, America's lagging innovation, its tangled bureaucracy, but the hesitations lingered, small hiccups that Andrew seized on like a vulture. The host interrupted, his voice rising as he questioned Elon's authority to critique a nation he seemed so unsure of. He painted a picture of a man out of his depth, a billionaire playing prophet with nothing solid to back it up. The crowd's reactions split. Some nodded along, others bristled at the cheap shots. Andrew didn't stop there. He leaned closer, his eyes glinting with malice as he twisted the knife, suggesting Elon's stumbles revealed a deeper flaw: arrogance masking incompetence. He mocked the idea of a stuttering visionary, implying that the real Elon was a far cry from the fearless trailblazer the world worshipped. The audience gasped as he crossed into personal territory, jabbing at Elon's relentless work ethic, his outsider status, even his accent, each barb a calculated strike meant to provoke. Elon's face darkened, his hands clenching into fists, but he held his tongue, letting the insults pile up. The host, emboldened by the silence, pushed further. He sneered at Elon's grand plans: Mars, AI, tunnels, dismissing them as delusions of a man who couldn't even speak straight under pressure. The audience grew louder, their murmurs swelling into a mix of jeers and uneasy laughter, feeding Andrew's fire. He sat back, arms spread wide, as if daring Elon to prove him wrong. The air thickened with hostility, the studio a pressure cooker ready to blow. Andrew was in his element, thriving on the chaos, blind to the shift brewing across the table. Elon's stillness wasn't surrender. It was a gathering storm. His eyes, locked on Andrew's, burned with a quiet intensity, the earlier uncertainty, replaced by something harder, sharper. The host didn't see it, too caught up in his own performance, but the audience did. Their noise softened, a hush falling as Elon straightened in his seat, his movements deliberate. Andrew fired one last volley, a snide remark about Elon's confidence being a sham, expecting it to land like the others. Instead, it hung there, unanswered, as Elon's gaze narrowed, his jaw setting with resolve. The tipping point had arrived. Elon leaned forward, his presence suddenly commanding, the room shrinking around him. Andrew's smirk flickered, a crack in his bravado as he sensed the shift too late. The audience held its breath, the tension snapping tight as Elon prepared to strike back. The cameras zoomed in, catching the sweat on Andrew's brow, the steel in Elon's stare. The hunter had become the hunted, and the reckoning was about to begin. The studio air crackled as Elon Musk leaned forward, his eyes pinning Andrew Brown to his chair like a specimen under glass. The host's smirk wavered, his hands twitching as Elon began to dismantle the mockery that had fueled the night. His voice, though still carrying traces of hesitation, now held a steely edge, each word deliberate as he turned the tables. He didn't lash out in anger. Instead, he dissected Andrew's attack with a cold, methodical precision that made the earlier stumbles seem irrelevant. Elon shifted the focus to Andrew's game, how the host had latched onto a stutter to avoid the real debate about America's future. He painted a picture of a man so desperate for relevance that he'd rather clown than engage, his barbs a distraction from his own shallow grasp of the issues. The audience stirred, some nodding as Elon's exposed the hollowness behind Andrew's bravado. The host's face tightened, his confidence eroding as Elon pressed on, his words gaining strength with every sentence. The billionaire didn't stop at defense. He went after Andrew's credibility, questioning how a talk show vulture could judge a life spent building things that outlasted cheap insults. He spoke of sleepless nights, of failures weathered, of a vision that didn't bend to mockery, his voice steadying as he found his rhythm. The crowd felt it, a shift from prey to predator, and their murmurs turned to scattered cheers. Andrew tried to interrupt, his voice sharp but unsteady. But Elon powered through, his presence swallowing the host's flailing attempts to regain control. Then came the gut punch. Elon zeroed in on Andrew's career, a string of gotcha moments and viral clips, all built on tearing others down. He suggested the host thrived on weakness because he had none of his own to offer, a parasite masquerading as a provocateur. The audience erupted, some gasping, others clapping, as the words landed like a hammer. Andrew's hands gripped the desk, his knuckles white, his eyes darting as the room slipped from his grasp. Elon's earlier stumbles were forgotten. This was a man in command, and Andrew was shrinking before him. The host scrambled, his voice rising in a weak counterattack. Something about Elon's ego, his wealth, but it fell flat, drowned by the crowd's growing roar. Elon didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his gaze unrelenting, and delivered a final blow. He flipped Andrew's taunt about confidence, framing it as a badge of humanity. Proof. He felt the weight of his words, unlike a host who tossed them like confetti. The studio shook with applause, the tide fully turned, as Andrew's face flushed a deep crimson, his bravado collapsing into a heap of sweat, and stammered excuses. The power had shifted irrevocably. Elon sat back, his expression calm but unyielding, letting the audience's energy wash over him. Andrew, once the aggressor, now looked small, his hands fumbling as he tried to regain footing on a stage that no longer belonged to him. The cameras captured every crack in his facade, the trembling lip, the averted gaze, while Elon's quiet triumph loomed large. The reckoning had arrived, and the host was drowning in it. The studio trembled under the weight of the audience's roar, a deafening tide that crashed over Andrew Brown as he sat, a broken figure in the ruins of his own arrogance. Elon Musk, his silhouette towering in the harsh studio light, held the room captive. His earlier stumbles now a distant memory swallowed by the force of his resurgence. The air thrummed with a primal energy, the crowd's cheers a howling wind that stripped the host bare. This wasn't just a comeback, it was a public execution, and Andrew's reign was bleeding out on live television. Elon didn't relent. His voice, now a thunderous current, rolled over the chaos as he drove his point home, painting Andrew as a relic of a dying breed, talk show tyrants who preyed on vulnerability to mask their own emptiness. He spoke of America's future again, his words soaring with a clarity that mocked the host's earlier taunts, each syllable a nail in the coffin of Andrew's credibility. The audience was on its feet, their applause a seismic wave, as Elon's gaze burned into the man across from him, unrelenting, unforgiving. Andrew's collapse was visceral. His shoulders hunched, his face a mask of sweat and desperation as he clawed for a lifeline. He tried to interrupt, his voice a shrill, fractured thing, hurling a final, feeble jab about Elon's wealth being his only strength. But it was a spark. Against a wildfire, Elon extinguished it with a single devastating turn. He leaned forward, his presence a looming storm, and laid bare the host's hypocrisy. A man who'd never built anything, never risked anything, daring to judge those who had. The crowd roared louder, a feral chant of approval that shook the walls as Andrew's hands trembled, his eyes wide with the terror of his own irrelevance. The studio became a crucible. The cameras, relentless in their focus, zoomed in on Andrew's, unraveling, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water, his chest heaving as the weight of his defeat crushed him. Elon stood, a colossus in the chaos, his departure a thunderclap that reverberated through the space. He didn't look back as he strode off, the audience's ovation a tidal surge that followed him, leaving Andrew alone in the wreckage. The host's head dropped, his hands covering his face, a pitiful shield against the storm he'd unleashed and couldn't survive. The show staggered to its end, Andrew's closing words a garbled whisper lost in the din of a crowd still chanting Elon's name. The screen faded to black, but the image lingered. Andrew, a shattered husk, dwarfed by the shadow of a man he'd dared to mock. Backstage, Elon paused, his breathing steady, a faint flicker of satisfaction crossing his face as he glanced at a live feed of the chaos he'd left behind. He walked on, the victor unbroken, while Andrew remained, the lights dimming on a career now in ashes. The viewers at home, their screens alight with frenzied comments, knew they'd seen a titan reclaim his ground. Elon had turned mockery into a weapon, forging a triumph so absolute that Andrew's name would forever echo as a cautionary tale. The night ended not with a whimper, but with a bang, a seismic shift that left no doubt. The man who'd stuttered had roared, and the host, who'd laughed, was silenced, buried under the weight of his own hubris.